All right, I think we're going to go ahead and just get started here. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Hudson Library and Historical Society's live event with Laura Thompson, author of Heiresses, The Lives of the Million Dollar Babies. Before we begin our program, I want to let you know that we have two more great author programs coming up for you next week. Barry Strauss will discuss his book, The Trojan War, A New History, on Wednesday, February 23rd at 7 p.m. And on Thursday, the 24th, Sarah Manning Peskin will be here to talk about her new book, A Molecule Away from Madness, Tales of the Hijacked Brain. And you can learn all about those programs and all of our others, and also sign up for all of these programs at hudsonlibrary.org. A reminder that if you're joining us on Zoom today, feel free to put your questions for Laura in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. Also, the Learned Owl, our local independent bookstore, is selling copies of today's book, and there's a link in the chat if you'd like to purchase one. So this afternoon, I am delighted to welcome author Laura Thompson. Laura won the Somerset Maugham Award for her first book, The Dogs, and is the author of the New York Times bestseller 6, The Lives of the Mitford Sisters. Her other books include the critically acclaimed Life in a Cold Climate, a biography of Nancy Mitford, and Agatha Christie, A Mysterious Life, which was nominated for an Edgar Allen Poe Award in 2019. Welcome, Laura. We're so pleased to have you with us today.
Oh, well, I'm thrilled to be here. It's lovely, lovely of you to have me.
Well, your book just came out Tuesday, and it's phenomenal. It really is something else, and it has been called endlessly entertaining, exquisite and gossipy, and deeply empathetic, and it certainly is all of those things. The book clearly required a huge amount of research since it covers the stories of heiresses from the 17th century through the 21st century in Britain and in the United States. And I'm wondering, how did you come to be interested in this topic?
Well, first of all, thank you for that gorgeous introduction. That's so nice to hear, because it was a really hard book to write. So to have you say those things, those are the things that make it worthwhile. That really is true. I was originally commissioned to write another book, a different book, sort of related, but not this specific heiress theme strand. But that was the strand that kept leaping out at me when I was researching the other book. I was doing a lot of reading of kind of interwar diaries and letters, people like Nancy Mitford, my beloved Nancy Mitford, and Evelyn Waugh, and Cecil Beaton, and James Lees Milne, you know, the usual suspects. And these names I kept getting interested, sidetracked by people like Winneretta Singer, the sewing machine heiress, who was one of 22 children, but managed to get quite a large chunk of the fortune when it all got divvied up. And also her niece, Daisy Fellows, who was a kind of socialite in Europe, again in this interwar period, another heiress. And Barbara Hutton, who was part of European cafe culture, you know, she lived over here a lot. And I just thought, no, hang on, this is my book. Here is my book. This is the one that I want to pursue. I want to interrogate this cliche of the poor little rich girl, you know, the one that Noel Coward wrote a song about and Henry James wrote a novella about. And this other cliche of money can't buy you happiness, because frankly, I've always thought, you know, let me try, because I think it might. You know, I'm a relatively very privileged person, but I've always thought that a million in the bank wouldn't hurt. And I thought, well, can this be true about money? Why did these women have such unhappy lives, so many of them? And I just wanted to go into it. And then I got very, very interested in the psychology of the heiress, the ones who did manage to be happy, the ones who simply could not shake off the heiress's burden, as it were, and also the men, the hangers-on, or the whole thing. And then to give it some heft, so it didn't just become a kind of, you know, too much about who had big diamonds and who had big yachts and all that kind of nonsense. I took it back in time, as you say, to the 17th century, so that it became, in a way, the subtext of the book is it's kind of like the march toward gender equality. It's kind of how these women who had money. First of all, it was so difficult for them to have money because legally they couldn't hold on to it once they got married, and then moving toward women having agency. So that in a sense is the subtext of the book. So it's not just about heiresses in a way, it's about all women, but heiresses write large all these themes, I found.
Absolutely. So, Kirkus Reviews commented that you know how to construct fascinating narratives out of dry research. And I'm guessing you didn't. I'm guessing you didn't find the research the least bit dry. And I'm curious to know, what was your research process and how long did the research take?
Yeah, gosh, that's nice. I never read reviews, but that's lovely because yeah, some of it, in a sense, was quite dry because of what I've said to you about this subtext of so I begin in the 17th century in London, and I begin with a woman who had also always interested me, a woman, well, she wasn't a woman, she was a kid, she was 12 when she got married off, called Mary Davis, who inherited pretty much by default. She was a great niece of a moneylender, and she inherited this expanse of marshland in what is now the middle of London, what is now Belgravia, Grosvenor Square, which is where the US Embassy used to be. Some of the most expensive real estate in the world. I say Mary was the winner in the real life game of Monopoly. But because a woman, once she got married, everything became his. You had one identity in law, and that was him. You were subsumed. He owned your body. He owned everything. He owned your children. You know, people tried to sort of squirrel bits away, but basically that was the legal situation. So Mary, by having this stupendous dowry, was almost more like prey than money brings power, one would think, but money for these women left them vulnerable. So I sort of trace from Mary, the ultimate heiress victim, if you like, I trace the legal changes that gave these women something closer to agency. And the big shift came in the late 19th century. Married Women's Property Act. You no longer gave everything to him once you got married. That was no longer the starting point, as it were. So that could have become like a textbook with all that legal stuff. But I tried very hard to liven it up, you know, to wrap a story around it, as it were, in illustration. And then once you got into the 20th century, it became much easier, really, to sort of jolly it along. But the early stuff, which I have to say in a way interested me the most, the lives of these women, the fact that being an heiress, certainly in England, these girls were seized off the street. They were date raped. They were forcibly married. There is a scene that I describe in the book, just like something out of The Handmaid's Tale, as I say. A girl taken off by all these women and taken upstairs into a house, and there's a priest there, and there's a man there, and it is absolutely extraordinary, and that, horrific. And that was the situation in England in the 18th century. Those things could happen, and if the man were bold enough and lucky enough, he would get away with it. If he weren't lucky enough, he would end up on the gallows. But it was a gambler society, and they thought it was worth the risk. So all of those stories, well, they're not dry at all, really. It's just the kind of as I say, the legalities that are propelling the story along, that I had to be careful not to let those become too textbook-like. But the stories themselves are so wild and extraordinary. I almost had to rein it in because the details were so lurid, some of them. The one who ran a needle into his wife's tongue to get her to sign away the little bit that she'd managed to keep away from him. My God. It's amazing stories, amazing.
Yeah, I would totally agree. When I started to read the book, I thought, I was expecting all the famous ones that you know about, Barbara Hutton and all of those. And really, there are more that I don't know and never have heard of than those that I did know, when I was reading the book. But there are just so many of them. And as you say, I'm sure you only scratched the surface of, how many there really were. But some of the stories are just unbelievable.
They really are. And what I did, I mean, to be perfectly honest, this was my method at the start, because I didn't want it to be too much Barbara Hutton, Doris Duke. We all, I'm hardly the first person to write about those women. Consuelo Vanderbilt, not too. I mean, of course, those women are in, but more in the general sweep of the thing. So what I did, the Times of London, the Times newspaper, has this incredible database that goes back to 1785, which is when the Times was first printed. So I went into the database, I typed the word heiress into the search engine, up came about 10,000 hits. And I just read every one of them. And some of the little snippets were so amazing. This little notice, heiress has eloped with a young man, and you would follow that through, and that would become this incredible story. Or sometimes when the family got hold of these men and it became a court case, every word in this court case would be printed in these newspapers. They were like cause célèbre. An heiress was almost like a movie star in those days, in a way. Everyone sort of was interested. Everyone followed the stories. They became the subjects of cartoonists who are, as I say, they're like the equivalent of the internet meme. The cartoons in these girls were known. They were well known, and who they were going to marry and who they might marry. It was all very much the stuff of news, really, in the papers, in a kind of tabloidy way, even in the Times. And then as time went on, people like the heiresses, the American heiresses, again, they were real celebrities. I remember reading about a party that was held, and they would lay a red carpet on the street leading up to the house in Mayfair or wherever it was. And the woman who was holding the party could not get to her own front door. There were so many people sort of lining the route to see all these people arriving. I should have known this stuff, really, but when you read it, you're kind of like, wow. Money and celebrity, they go hand in hand, but it was just so interesting, again, to sort of tracing the arc of the 350 years or whatever that I cover. That was really interesting to me, because as I say, I'm not a historian. I was learning a lot of stuff, and really glad to have learned this stuff.
So my question is, how long did it take you to figure all that out and decide what you were going to put in the book, what you weren't going to put in the book, and then how long did it take you to actually write the thing, because it's a lot. And I don't, I don't want people to think that the book is, a 20 volume set or anything. It's just a perfect size for reading, and here it is.
Oh, lovely. Yes, and because I tried to pick out the interesting details. It could have been 50 times as long. The subject, I hadn't realized, the subject is immense. Money is fascinating. Money filtered through femaleness, if you like, was so incredibly interesting, because, as I say, the law, the norm was not that women would have money in their own right. The heiress only came about because there was no man to inherit. That was the norm before, the late 19th century, really, in this country. So all those things were just so interesting. And how long did it take? Well, I was going to do the other book. And then this kind of filtered through into becoming this one. And St. Martin's was so great. They didn't mind me changing. They were so lovely about it and understanding. I suppose it, all in all, about 2 years, maybe. But I like writing quickly, because I like the I like to sort of, I like the feel of it kind of moving quite fast. But I suppose getting it all in there took the time. Also, quite a lot of it was written during the year of the real lockdowns, so you couldn't go anywhere or anything. I mean, the YouTube was my dear friend, because I had to find out quite a lot. You know, you couldn't, and as I say, newspapers and all that kind of thing, and being able to get books online. But that was when I mostly wrote it, was during the height of that first lockdown, really.
So I'm not the only author that's had a book come out recently that has said that.
Yeah.
Perhaps we spawned more books than we anticipated because of the pandemic. I'm not sure.
Yeah. No, I'm sure. Yeah.
But so you brought up Mary Davis, and she's the first heiress that you talk about. And I mean, my heart just bled for her, Can you talk about her just a little bit more? Her story?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, do you know that part of London where her fields were? I mean,
a little bit, yes.
Yeah, I mean, the glory of Belgravia with these fantastic vanilla ice cream color houses that are like, where, well, now oligarchs live in them, but it used to be prime ministers and aristocrats, and these wonderful squares, and these, I mean, really the nicest, aesthetically the nicest part of London. And also Grosvenor Square, which, as I say, is where the US Embassy was. This incredible, stately, really lovely. When London was really in the process of being, developed apace. And so she, as I say, she inherited these fields, about 1,000 acres worth of, all the land had to be drained and everything. There was not really anything there. And she was 12, and she had a shrewd mother who I think must have been a bit of a, bitch, but with an eye to the main chance. And she used to parade. I mean, even though the land was marshland, people knew that it had value. And she used to parade this kid in Hyde Park in a coach and four, sort of showing her off to prospective buyers, really, like a horse or something. And in the end, she was bought. I think, forgive me, because there's so many facts in this poor brain. I think it was £9,000 he paid for her in 1677. So, a lot, but still a hell of a bargain. That was Sir Thomas Grosvenor. And then she went off with it. He was a decent man. A lot of these men were really not, but he was fine. The problem came when she was widowed at the age of 35, having never done anything, having been this doll, really, that was, she had no education to speak of. She had no, I mean, even to say the word agency is sublimely inappropriate. That was just not on the table. And then when she was widowed, still a relatively young woman, she sought agency in a way that was so ill-conceived as to be, as you say, your heart bleeds. She got taken up by she converted to Catholicism, which in England at that time was not a good idea, because it was, it was just, it really wasn't. Catholicism was not what was required by people of power or whatever. She got taken up by a priest. She traveled to Paris with this priest and his sexy younger brother, and then was date raped, really. They sprinkled the equivalent of something like rehypnol on a dish of strawberries. She ate them, passed out, woke up, told that she'd been married off to the sexy brother by the priest. And then ensued this unbelievable farrago of kind of court cases and what have you, on the part of her family, who were like desperate, what the hell, where are the marshy fields, to get them off this guy who had, forcibly married her. And then she ended up being placed in a kind of, not in an asylum, but being declared mad, which was something that people often did to these women. You know, it's not just in the novels of Wilkie Collins or whatever. It was a trick that families, husbands could play on these girls, say they were mad, have them confined, something like that, just to get their hands on the money. I mean, I say in the book, it was better to have money, except when it wasn't. And that it really is, you really were so vulnerable. And by degrees, the women started to realize, and then you started to get families to get a bit savvier, and they almost had like a system of private law for these very, very rich women, which of course gradually filtered out into the into the general population. But it was so powerless to have money as a woman, unless you were very aristocratic. And then you had a kind of double protection, because of course with England, it's always about class. It's so ridiculous. But if you were like Margaret, Duchess of Portland, who owned all the land to the north of Oxford Street, the kind of shopping thoroughfare that still runs through the middle of London. Mary Davis owned everything beneath. Margaret Portland more or less owned everything above. But Margaret was an aristocratic woman, a creature of the Enlightenment, born about 50 years after Mary, a different kind of society. She was educated, she had intellectual curiosity, and her life was lovely, blessed. So I sort of compare and contrast, really, because some of these heiresses did find meaning in what they had. They either became philanthropists, or they became patrons, or they just enjoyed it. They spent it and they just enjoyed it. But an amazing number of them simply did not know how to find meaning. They were, when I talk about the heiress's burden, they seem to have been plagued by the sense that where is my worth? Where is my true worth? What is my intrinsic worth when there's so much of the extrinsic stuff flying around, you know? And of course, that's the glorious Washington Square by Henry James that sort of exemplifies that dilemma to utter perfection.
So you said that you were fascinated, especially by the earlier heiresses, which, you know, of course, I didn't know about them either. And two of them that you talked about were Mary Stoney Bowles and Catherine Tilney Long. And they both married men that were just incomprehensibly horrible to them. And it just blew my mind when I was reading it. You know, why do you think that they were drawn to these types of men? And can you talk about these types of men a little bit?
Yeah, because they're really interesting. I mean, Mary Bowes, who is a direct ancestor of the Queen, present Queen, through her mother's side. And she had a lot of coal mines, or her father did. And she, first of all, she married, she became the Countess Strathmore, and that was fine. But then when he died, well, I suppose it's our old friend sex. I suppose these men were very sexy. They had, the adventurer men who went after, I mean, heiress hunting was a thing. It was a fashion. You get it in Jane Austen. You get it at, Wickham going after Georgiana Darcy. And so when's that? 1817 or something, is it? Pride and Prejudice. Sorry, 1813. Can't remember, 1813, I think. But Mary Bowes is a bit earlier. But, and who's the other one? Catherine Tilney Long, yes. So she was right at the start of the 19th century. So she, in fact, the story is that Jane Austen changed the surname of the heroine of Northanger Abbey to make it Tilney. So she became Catherine Tilney as a kind of reference to Catherine Tilney Long, because she was so well known. As I say, these heiresses were like celebrities. She really was a well-known kind of Regency it girl, you know, and she was she was so rich. I mean, just insanely rich, but just by accident, really, as I say, because everyone else died. And she was being pursued by the man who became King William IV, which is a really interesting counterfactual, because if she had married him, which would have been sensible, but he was, you know, very unattractive. But if she had married him, she was able to have children. You wouldn't have had Queen Victoria, because it would have been one of Catherine's children who would have been on the throne. But instead of marrying him, she married the nephew of the Duke of Wellington, William Wellesley Pole, who must have been, I mean, he must have been very, very, you know, attractive. But nobody's that fanciable that you, I mean, it's a horror story what happened to this lovely girl. And reading her letters, you do feel she absolutely adored him. And the worse he behaved, the more she adored him. And sadly, we're familiar with that awful, you know, I talk about this in the book, you know, that the awful sort of the joke of love, really, that it so rarely relates to the deservingness of the love object. You know, it's got nothing to do with it, really. She just adored this guy, and he did run through the most incredible fortune. He paraded his mistress in front of her and everything. He may have murdered her. We don't know. We don't know. But the psychology of the men interested me. And Andrew Stoney the same, who became the subject of Thackeray's first novel, actually, Barry Lyndon. Because, you know, the fictional counterparts of these people, I do write about that quite a lot, because that's also very interesting. There's an anger in these men. There is a real anger in these men, that even though they could marry these women and get the money, and it would be theirs in law, that still wasn't quite enough for them. It was like they were raging at the fact that they even had to do that. It was like, why is this not mine in the first place? It should be mine. You know, there's a rage that they even have to contend with these women. And Andrew Stoney, who, oh God, he was a bastard. I'm sorry. And he did end up in prison, where he managed to, I think he had 5 children in prison or something. So they must have had charm, else they couldn't have pulled these things off. But he, you know, Regency bucks, I don't know, Mr. Wickham in Pride and Prejudice, you know, they must have been, as I say, they had a rock star gleam, and the public kind of adored them. When Andrew Stoney and Mary Bowes were face to face in the public arena, you know, because to divorce then it had to be by act of parliament. Public sympathy, this was all played out in the newspapers. Public sympathy was really with him. It was really with him. They knew they ought to be sympathetic to her, but they couldn't help being sympathetic to him, because like him, they kind of resented her having so much money. And they just thought he was the daredevil. He was the, you know, he was the man. He was like a kind of highwayman type. And it's this awful thing in public opinion that it doesn't always sort of stray toward virtue, or it's kind of lured by vice. But these stories, as I say, they were cause célèbre. And when people eloped, the crowds would line the streets and sort of, you know, it is a fascinating world. It really is. Just thinking about it now, I'm compelled by the images that are kind of created by it.
It certainly was a different time, that's for sure.
Thank God.
You know, it just, you know. So let's talk about all the American heiresses who bailed out the British aristocracy. You know, those of us who watched and loved Downton Abbey, we know that, you know, Cora kind of bailed out Lord Grantham, and, you know, so I didn't realize that was such a common thing.
Yes, that was, what did they say, that family dynamic was kind of based on George Curzon, Lord Curzon, who had no son, like, what's his name? Grantham, Lord Grantham, no son, hence you know. That's the origins of the whole Downton Abbey plot lines, isn't it? So that, yes, I mean, the famous one obviously is Consuelo Vanderbilt, who married the Duke of Marlborough, and yeah, he got the roof fixed at Blenheim Palace, and she got a title, or her mother Alva wanted the title. I mean, it's a horror story, but not quite with such, in those previous era, there are kind of physical ramifications. That the law would say, well, it's all right to beat your wife, but don't kick her. That we don't know. The law would draw the line at that. Okay, so by the late 19th century, things had become a bit more civilized, but nevertheless, these girls were traded. They really were. And the American press did start to, with its more, one might say, egalitarian or enlightened outlook, did start to sort of say as much. But equally, some of the marriages were successful, and there was a quid pro quo. I mean, when the first one was Jenny Jerome, so the mother of Winston Churchill, and her father was a Wall Street speculator, really. So obviously, they couldn't get into high New York society, which was the whole 400, all that, and in a way just as rigid as English society, London society, as we know if we've read The Age of Innocence and et cetera, et cetera. So the Jeromes came, the mother, Clara, and her gorgeous daughters went to Paris, which was a fascinating society, Napoleon III, very sophisticated, very, quite an education, you can imagine, and then came to London, where they did dazzle the men with their wonderful dresses from Worth and their intelligent conversation and their personality and their, it was in a kind of, aristocratic British society can be quite enervating. So I can imagine that these girls were very welcome, but of course the English women were, what on earth? This is terrible. How are we going to find husbands for ourselves when all these gorgeous girls are coming over from America? So that was, you can imagine. But the Prince of Wales, Victoria's son, who became King Edward VII, he adored them. I mean, he adored women full stop, and he adored these American women. And he became their kind of social sponsor, really. And a couple of them married friends of his. Minnie Stevens became the wife of Arthur Paget, who was a good racing friend of the Prince of Wales, etc. And they became integrated into London society and were an incredibly welcome injection of new blood. And indeed, a woman like Maud Burke of San Francisco, who came over and married Sebastian Cunard, who liked living on his house in Leicestershire and making metal things and, hunting and stuff. She married him, became Lady Cunard, and then went to London and became the most significant social hostess of the interwar period. And was, with being American, it was a shot in the arm for London society. But I mean, for people like Consuelo Vanderbilt, it was very unhappy being married to someone who didn't love her and whom she didn't love, and knowing that you'd been bartered by your own mother. Not good. But eventually she got out of it and remarried, and that story does have a relatively happy ending. But it's, unbelievable. Again, unbelievable. But I mean, marriages still get arranged, I suppose, even though we don't say it. People, I'm sure, all these things. But then it was very, very blatant. But Consuelo sort of takes us into the next era, because she became interested in more progressive politics. She actually stood as a progressive in a council election in London, which was quite a thing. And you see this wonderful bit of patho film of her. She's, a head taller than all these people, and it's a really interesting little social document. And she moved into an era where a more equal society was becoming something, votes for women, etc., taking us into the 20th century and a whole, as it were, part 3 of the book.
Yeah, it does. It is interesting how it changes over time. You can see it with your different stories slowly progressing. There were some heiresses that were pretty eccentric.
Yes.
And one of them was Alice Silverthorne. And say about her, she was a rebel against nothing in particular. And she had a lion cub. So could you just tell us a little bit about her story?
Oh yeah, she fascinated me, Alice de Jonze. I mean, have you seen White Mischief, Kathy, the film?
No.
Well, it's not the greatest film, but it's a great subject, and it looks great, and etc. It's centers upon a murder that took place during the Second World War in Kenya, which was then a British colony, and there was a kind of enclave in Kenya of British colonials called the Happy Valley Set, who were decadent in their bones. They were really like a world unto themselves. They all slept with each other. They did what the hell they liked. Alice de Jonze became a part of that, but she wasn't really like that. She was a Chicago heiress, a very unhappy childhood. It's amazing how many of these women, their mothers had died very young, when they were very young. And the mothers were young, obviously. Barbara Hutton, Daisy Fellows, Alice, they lost their mothers when they were very, very young. Alice's father wanted to get custody of her, but he didn't. She went to her very Chicago socialite relations, and she was a rebel. She was a rebel. She was meant to be at, debutante balls, and she was out with Chicago gangsters and what have you. So we're getting to the 1920s by now, obviously. And then she married a French aristocrat, which was another heiress trope, if you like, to marry, the European aristocrat. That kind of continued even with Barbara Hutton, obviously. And she had, they went to Kenya. She fell in love with Africa. She was always looking for, you can't say freedom because she had too much freedom. And she had 2 children and she didn't really want them. But she felt guilt about it. She really was a lost soul. She was fantastically beautiful. But she became for me the kind of, almost even more than Barbara Hutton, the emblem of the heiress for whose money had rendered everything devoid of a fundamental meaning. Like I use the phrase blank sumptuous similarity, the blank sumptuous similarity of the days, when there's no sense of context, there's no sense of normal life, there's no sense of what money being earned, money being of what the world might be when you're not in this perpetual sort of sunlight almost, that you're craving shadow, you're craving hunger almost. And talk about a first world problem. But the misery of these women was real. Rich people can be unhappy too, and posh people can be unhappy too. And Alice, she seemed to find significance in Kenya, and then even that sort of evaporated. And she had this wonderful, there's this wonderful picture of her, this lovely woman sitting with this lion cub draped on her. I mean, I so wanted that lion cub. Oh my God. And he was like her soulmate. And there's a story attached to him, which I won't tell, but it's a tough story. And then in the end, there's a famous line in White Mischief when she opens the curtains and sees the sunlight and says, "Oh my God, not another beautiful bleep, bleep day." And that did seem like the cri de coeur of of the unhappy heiress, the one that's possessed by a sense that too much freedom is terrifying, that too much money is kind of wrong. Oh, is that Alice you've got there? Oh, there she is. There she is with Samson.
Yeah.
Oh my God, he's so lovely. And then on the right, that's Rose Dugdale. She was a real rebel heiress, the one going like that. She was an English debutante who joined the IRA, the Irish Republican movement, and went to jail for her convictions. Because in the third part of the book, you get this whole, right, so we've moved toward gender equality. Now we're moving toward, if you like, societal equality, which of course we're not there. Is it possible? I don't know. There's a whole moral question in this book. Should these women even have this money? Of course, but I mean, that's not my job to answer that. But as the 20th century moves on, you do get this awareness within the more intelligent ones of them that there's to say the least, an imbalance here. And Barbara Hutton did say in an interview, only a generation separates me from the girls who serve in the Woolworth store, and I'm the Woolworth heiress, and I've got $50 million plus, and they're on $20 a week. And she was aware of, and I think felt guilt about it, and indeed offloaded almost her entire fortune, but not in a meaningful way. That eluded her. But you did find with the more sensitive ones among them that a sense of why do I have this money and I haven't earned it, and and so you started to get these women who were what I call the rebel heiresses, like Rose Dugdale, who joined the Irish Republican movement. And Alice was a rebel, but as you said, she didn't have a cause. And then you get Nancy Cunard, who was a rebel with a cause, and how she was an advocate for racial equality at a time when that was bold and new and splendid. And she said, I want to own nothing. And she did, in the end, own nothing. She became a fighter in the anti-fascist cause of the Spanish War, of the Spanish Civil War, and then worked for the resistance in the Second World War, and ended up. Well, again, it's a tragic story. She was sort of burned with a kind of masochistic fervor, but in a good cause, in a noble cause. And she was a really interesting figure, not least because her mother was Emerald Cunard, who was holding her parties in Grosvenor Square and, the Queen of London society. But as I say in the book, these hostesses, like the salonière of a slightly earlier period, like Winneretta Singer, Natalie Barney, who also was an heiress in Paris during the wonderful, Joyce, Hemingway, all that brilliant period in Paris. For a woman to have power then, you really pretty much had to wield it in the domestic arena. You couldn't become the president of the United States. You were still limited in what you could do, however much money you had. So you did find them wielding power in the domestic sphere. And in England, the social hostess was the kind of English equivalent of the salonière. I'd say a salon for the shooting classes. So you've got people like Emerald Cunard, you've got people like Mrs. Greville, who was hilarious, who cultivated royalty and she had this wonderful house where you always had central heating, so everyone wanted to go there. And she was a political hostess of some significance. They were fun to write about. They were hilarious, really. And it's such an interesting period, that interwar period. It's the style of it.
Yeah. I know you say you're not a historian, but of course there's an awful lot of history inherent in the stories that you tell. And I don't think that our audience could see the picture that we were referring to. So
is that? Oh, that's, yes,
Alison. That's the lion cub. So
That gorgeous line.
So funny.
So gorgeous.
So I don't want to not mention the fact that you have injected some humor in this book, because some of these stories are tragic and serious and all of that. And two of my favorite lines, you were talking about Alva Vanderbilt's divorce in the late 1800s, and you called it the biggest divorce case ever known in the world. And then you said, "Take that, Henry VIII." I just cracked me up, you know. And then also you said, you're talking about the American heiress, Romaine Goddard, whose husband referred to her inheritance as ours. Mm-hmm. And your comment was, "Cue the heiress early warning system."
Yeah. Yes. Oh my God. Yes, exactly. Yes. I tried to keep it light. I mean, some of the stories you can't. There's nothing light about Nancy Cunard. There's nothing light about Mary Davis. My goodness. Mary Davis is like something out of Bram Stoker. And Nancy is a figure of fiery tragedy, really. But the linking passages, which were really the hardest things to write, you know, the bridge from one woman to the next, without that just becoming, okay, that's the end of that bit, now for this one. You know, you wanted to link it in a sort of interesting manner. That was really hard. And I did. And I tried to keep it contemporary. I reference Harry and Meghan, and to try to keep the idiom contemporary so that it didn't feel too weighty, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Anyway, I like jokes in books. I think they're always. I always like a joke.
No, it was great. I mean, the Henry VIII line was, to be honest, I just cracked up.
Oh, well, you are loving. Well, it was hilarious because it was all over the American press, wasn't it? And they said, "Oh, this is significant." Yeah, no, it's. I was fascinated by Alva Vanderbilt. I mean, she's clearly a very, American people are going to know more about her than I possibly can because I'm coming at her from the outside. But to me, she was reprehensible in many ways, but I did admire the, in an age where women were still generally viewed as passive beings. However, the law had become more friendly toward them. They were still, there's these women who were up and at it. I did admire them, and no one was more that than Alva.
Well, so my next question was going to be, do you have a favorite heiress? So would that be Alva?
Well, Alva is a kind of, she's almost a passing figure, but I did admire her. And I did admire. I kind of loved writing about Daisy Fellows, Wicked Daisy, as Nancy Mitford called her, who was the niece of Winnaretta Singer and who was this interwar socialite. She was kind of saved by a self-mocking, self-knowing irony. I always felt she was so badly behaved, and so she seduced everybody's husband. She tried to seduce Winston Churchill. God knows why, but she did. I don't think she succeeded, but she was a buccaneer, not in the Edith Wharton sense. She kind of attacked life, and was incredibly chic. She was the muse for Schiaparelli, and she just was fierce and very intelligent. She wrote clever little novels. And so although she was an heiress, and although she did nothing noble with her money, she just enjoyed it, even though in some ways she had a life equally sad as melancholic as Barbara Hutton's. But Barbara had a kind of victim passive mentality, and Daisy was, so I liked her. But my heroine is Angela Burdett Coutts, without a shadow of a doubt. She is my heroine. She is the 19th century heiress who, she's an outlier, really. She came into her fortune in Coutts Bank, banking for, so the Royal, that's still the Queen's Bank. She came into her fortune in 1837. So the same year that Queen Victoria came to the throne. So she was almost, they were almost contemporary. And she seemed to view her fortune in the same way that Victoria would have viewed becoming queen, as a destiny. So Angela, she was a young woman. She'd been selected to inherit this fortune, aside from every other member of her family who must have all been seething about it. But she got it because she was trusted to do the right thing with it. And she really so did. She was a very significant philanthropist. She worked with Charles Dickens, obviously, you know, a highly developed social conscience. They formed a house together where they were for what they called fallen women, for prostitutes to try and rebuild their lives. And they did have quite a high success rate. There was a kind of hands-on quality to her philanthropy. You know, she installed drinking troughs for working animals all over the country. She did things like that, as well as grander schemes. She sent large amounts of money to help with the Irish potato famine, all things like that. She was, there is a coda to Angela's story that is a very surprising coda and very fascinating, I found. But generally, she was a noble, good woman who took on the heiress's burden, because it is a burden. The moral of this book really is that relative poverty is something to be treasured, because money really does not bring you happiness. But she took it on and did what was right with it. And I love her. I just love Angela Burdett-Coutts so much.
Yeah, and she is the subject of the epilogue in the book.
Yeah.
So you do write about her. And one of our patrons is asking a really good question, I think. Did you get a chance to meet any descendants of these heiresses you researched?
That is a great question, and I really wish I had. But the word lockdown yeah, it was, you say you've had several authors who wrote books during that period. And I don't know whether it made the book, it did, it made the books different. You know, the research was necessarily different. And, you know, maybe, well, certainly in a novel or something, I imagine that there's the sense of confinement or whatever could seep through. I don't think it does in this book, but no, you couldn't meet. I saw two people for, I don't know, however many months, but I wish I had. I wish I could have done. Perhaps that possibility is still open to me. I don't know. I mean, the book stops. It really stops when prenups save the day. With the cast iron prenup, in a sense, marks the end of the story that I tell in this book, in a way. Because even now, if you marry the wrong guy, which, you know, happens, as an heiress, you may go through emotional trauma, but your fortune cannot really be damaged in that same way, unless you're, you know, spectacularly unlucky. We're still interested in heiresses, but a woman like Paris Hilton, who kind of monetizes her own money, if you like, in a way, with the whole reality television, all that kind of thing. I mean, clever, really clever, but they're not stories in the same way as the, I think the arc of my book finishes in a sense with Barbara Hutton, because she's the last of her type. And the law now is not, when you're that rich, that's all that matters. Your gender is not what matters. It's just who's got the most money, and it's going to be her. So in a sense, that concludes the book. So in circuitous answer to that very good question, I don't know who. I suppose there would be descendants of some of these people, but it is relatively in the past, this book, I suppose.
Yes. So we're just about out of time. Just wondering if you have a new project on the horizon.
Wow, gosh, that went fast. Well, I don't have a book. I've been writing a script, as a TV script, which I have to say have loved. And the strong contrast to this book where, so many words and so many facts and all that kind of thing. So writing a TV script was a lovely antidote. And I'm about to start the second draft of that. So that's what's been occupying my time. But of course, I would love to start another book this year. But any ideas gratefully received. I'm a writer in search of an idea. Yeah.
Well, while you're doing your play, I'm sure something will come to you. They
come. They suddenly come.
Yes,
yeah.
Something will speak to you for sure.
Well,
so,
that's a lovely, thank you. Yeah, that's a nice thought.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much to Laura for joining us today. I want to put the book up one more time. This is the book. It's definitely worth your time. So many fascinating stories in it. And of course, some humor as well. Thank you to everyone who is watching today. Please don't forget to check our website for our authors coming up next week and all the other great stuff we have going on here at the Hudson Library. And everybody have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you everyone for